To say Mary Jane has seen some stuff would be an understatement. This woman has lived through more trauma than I think a normal person could even imagine. Today we'll be unpacking more of Mary Jane's emotional and physical baggage as we count down the top 10 worst things that happened to Mary Jane, part 2. That's right, if you missed the part 1 to this list and you want to learn even more about the horrible things Mary Jane has had to live through, be sure to check that out. But for now, let's get counting. Number 10 was creeped upon. Hardcore creeped upon. During Spectacular Spider-Man, there were a few issues where Mary Jane was feeling particularly lonely, and Jason Jerome, an actor she had worked with, saw an opportunity to try and seduce her. Also, Jason Jerome just sounds like the most jerky name ever. If you ever meet someone named Jason Jerome, I feel like you should be warned. Something weird might happen. Also, sorry if your name is Jason Jerome, I'm sure you're a lovely person. Jason insisted he knew how she felt and that she wanted him just as badly as he wanted her. She definitely felt something, but after every move he put on her, she would insist that she loved her husband Peter Parker and wasn't interested, despite her feeling somewhat tempted due to Peter's long absences. In the end, however, she finally told him off by inviting him over, only to toss the bottle of wine that he'd brought with him back at him, causing it to shatter and spill, ruining his pants. Also, I don't know about you, but I've never thrown a bottle of wine so hard that it shattered, especially if it hit a person. I don't know if Jason Jerome is just made of something really hard or what's going on there. I also love that Mary Jane and Peter have a poster of Peter's face by their door, which is really strange. Like a full-on, and she's like, this picture of me and Peter. Not creepy at all. Mary Jane had to put up with a lot of Jason being creepy for multiple issues and even at times appearing to stalk her. Ew. Number 9. Used as a human shield. Even when Mary Jane first met Spider-Man, she was smitten with him, even though it was under pretty terrifying circumstances. During one of the first times that Spider-Man ever saved Mary Jane, she was out go-go dancing at a club, hired to dance up on stage and take pictures of the patrons at their tables in between. Suddenly, an attack broke out, featuring goons armed with guns. One of them even manages to take Mary Jane hostage briefly, using her as a human shield. Fortunately, he and his gun are no match for Spider-Man, who thwip clogs up the barrel with his webbing. Spider-Man saves the day and saves Mary Jane. She seems too enamored with Spider-Man to even react to what just happened, but being held at gunpoint and used as a human shield in the middle of a fight has to be traumatizing. However, this wouldn't be Mary Jane's first brush with danger, nor would it be her last. Before we move on to this next point, just a quick reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you are enjoying it, and if you want more videos like this, or more videos about Mary Jane, because Mary Jane's awesome. Number 8. Got blown up. In one of the most recent issues of Amazing Spider-Man, spoiler alert, skip this point if you don't want me to spoil things, Mary Jane gets blown the heck up by one of Green Goblin's pumpkin bombs. That's right, Green Goblin is back, baby! But of course, the awful part is that Mary Jane is about to end up in the middle of the crossfire after joining Harry Osborn and Peter in a dank crypt for a horrific dinner party. I guess I should say like demon Harry Osborn, because he's like part demon, part I don't know what's really fully going on there. It's complex. Mary Jane ends up being pretty much targeted in the explosion after trying to sacrifice herself to save Peter. Ain't that just the way? But somehow, miraculously, she survives at least. It's later revealed what MJ's fate is, but I won't spoil the latest issue for those who haven't gotten to read it yet. Regardless, this one explosive panel was pretty brutal to look at as a fan of Mary Jane. Number 7. Chameleon tried to manipulate her. A lot of people have tried to creep on Mary Jane. Even Peter's villains have tried to get in on that creeping action, in the worst way possible too. At one point, Chameleon attempted to convince Mary Jane to sleep with him by trying to trick her, coming in disguised as Peter Parker. Fortunately, we found out Mary Jane has a spidey sense of her own. Her version displayed here seems to imply that MJ can sense when Peter is actually the one kissing her, so this would be seemingly forgotten later on in continuity by other writers. She said kissing Chameleon made her skin crawl, and immediately she knew something was up. Although this is awful, it did give us a really awesome MJ moment as well, as Mary Jane threatens Chameleon afterward, completely prepared to fight and defend herself. Back off, Chameleon! Also love when Mary Jane gets badass moments like that where she's like, I'm feisty too, I can take ya. Number 6. Constantly being ditched for danger. This happens to Mary Jane more than once when she needs Peter. Honestly, she has to be one of the most understanding girlfriends and wives of the comic book world. Sure, it took her a while to take her and Peter's relationship seriously, but one thing she doesn't really do is judge Peter for wanting to be a hero hero. She might worry about his safety constantly and their family's safety, but she pretty much exclusively supports his need to be Spider-Man. And even when he doesn't necessarily have to go off to do the hero thing, she still supports him leaving her in times of need. The amount of times this comes up is far too often for me to count. Poor Mary Jane, she's just alone to worry most of the time. Number 5. Attacked by Harry Osborn. Mary Jane has been one of the targets of many different attacks over the years, where villains were attempting to get back at Spider-Man. But one attack also likely extended to include her, not just because she was attached to Spider-Man, but because she was no longer dating the culprit. Harry Osborn in issue 136 of the original Amazing Spider-Man series attempted to blow up both Peter Parker and Mary Jane when they came home and opened the door. Mary Jane at the time had decided to unlock the door for Peter as a fun, rebellious, feministic act, which is weird, but if you read the issue makes sense, pretending to be a female chauvinist. Fortunately, as the explosion was about to go off, Peter's spidey sense started alerting him of danger, and he managed to jump in between Mary Jane and the explosion. Still, she would later end up being kidnapped by Harry as well in the same arc, along with Aunt May and Flash Thompson. Number 4. Kidnapped by Jonathan Caesar. Yeah, that's right, Mary Jane gets kidnapped a lot, that's a thing. I just talked about her being kidnapped, and also on part 1 of this list we talked about Mary Jane being kidnapped by a mutant who wanted to become Peter Parker and take over his life. But this time around, she was kidnapped by a man who is obsessed with her herself and wanted to marry Mary Jane, even though she was already married. Apparently when you have enough money you can ignore that people are married, that's what's claimed here. Caesar kidnapped Mary Jane and hid her in an apartment in Bedford Towers, which he owned. The apartment was made especially for this purpose, showing off just how crazy the millionaire real estate mogul Jonathan really was. Caesar's plan was to marry MJ and live happily ever after with her, but she had other plans and she tried to escape. Surprise, surprise. Eventually, despite Jonathan threatening her with violence, she did manage to get away and get back to the arms of Spider-Man. Although we never really delve into what mark this left on Mary Jane emotionally, she just seems to kind of get over it all quite quick. Like Peter's like, "Can you go back home by yourself?" And she's like, "Yeah, it's fine." I'd be like, "No, don't leave me. This is terrifying." Number 3. Manipulated by Wolverine. This was just plain wrong all around. Because the ultimate reality is often known for taking things too far, it was in this reality that Wolverine tried to manipulate Mary Jane into sleeping with him just because he didn't like Spider-Man, and I guess because he also likes redheads, but also, what is happening? Spider-Man and Wolverine have a touchy relationship even in the 616 continuity. In fact, we've seen how mad Peter gets when Wolverine even mentions Mary Jane's name in a context that he doesn't like. Remember that time he punched him out of a window through what was supposed to be unbreakable glass? If Peter wasn't just a kid at the time in the ultimate reality, I'm sure he would have done much worse. Wolverine, while in Peter's body, attempted to put the moves on Mary Jane, who innocently did not know that someone else was in her boyfriend's body. That thing where people forget about, Mary Jane's spidey sense, like I was saying. This is all kind of gross for multiple reasons, one being consent, another being that Wolverine is an adult man and is also like hundreds of years old, and MJ is just a teenager here, and another being that this was all about getting back at Peter. Fortunately, MJ does not end up being pressured into sleeping with Wolverine while he's in Peter's body, but it is implied that at least something physical happened between these two. Number 2. Manipulated by Dr. Octopus. This one happened when Dr. Octopus was in fact in Peter Parker's body, which I think makes it worse than if Mary Jane had actually made out with Dr. Octopus in his actual body. At the time, of course, MJ thought that Otto was actually Peter, since he'd swapped bodies with Peter and was living his life as him. She noted that he was behaving differently, but dismissed these red flags because she was just so happy to be with Peter again. Mary Jane, knowing Peter for as long as she has, however, you would think would therefore know something was amiss even instinctively, but apparently writers disagreed or just really wanted to see this happen for some reason. Mary Jane in fact almost at one point takes things to the next level with Superior Spider-Man, but fortunately they get interrupted. Thank goodness. Number 1. Smashed into a wall. A lot of people like to refer to this one as the time when Peter hit Mary Jane, but this was actually much more than a hit. Mary Jane came up from behind to try and break up the fight between Ben Reilly, Peter's clone, and Peter Parker. Not seeing her, Peter swung back and didn't just hit her, he knocked her back so hard with his fist that she slammed back into the wall and seemingly broke part of the machinery behind her. Honestly, I'm surprised she didn't just die right there, because that seems like a lot. Spider-Man is much stronger than he looks, having the proportional strength of a spider. Even worse, she was pregnant at the time. Very pregnant. Although during her pregnancy, you might not have known it because from issue to issue, her belly seems to like swell and then flatten and then swell again. But that's comics for you. What do you think are some of the worst things Mary Jane has suffered through? Is there anything you still feel that we've missed? Let us know in the comments below. This has been Top 10 Nerd, and I'm your host Amanda McKnight. Thank you so much for watching. You stay nerdy, YouTube.